It's 2006, and Steve Jobs is about to close the deal that will sell Pixar to Disney for $7.4 billion. And of course, we can't read his mind, but we're sure he's ecstatic and relieved. You see, this sale marks the end of a journey so challenging, it almost sent Steve Jobs into bankruptcy. Let's discover that story in today's episode of Forensics. How Pixar was born. So back in the 70s, designers had one obsession: creating the first ever computer animated feature film. The challenge was so clear that they called it simply the movie. And the idea was pretty ludicrous. Animators needed computing power that was just impossible to get at the time. Still, they believed that in the future they would be able to do so. And why were they so sure? Well, because of Moore's law. Moore's law states that on average, every 2 years, the number of transistors in a processor can double. So in time, computer power will increase, and all they had to do was wait. So Ed Catmull, Malcolm Blanchard, David DeFrancesco, and Alvy Ray Smith were some of these visionaries. They joined the New York Technical Institute in 1975 with that goal. And they had some results. They came up with a short called Sunstone, which is creepy, but creepy or not, it drew the attention of George Lucas. He stole the animators from the NYIT and got them to work for Lucasfilm in 1980. And their division would be the Computer Graphics Group, or CGG. So the CGG would work in design, editing, special effects, and three-dimensional animations, but they also worked on a little bit of hardware called the Pixar Image Computer. So this device would be 4 times as fast as other computers in processing pixels. But not yet. You see, this team was working for the future, not for the now. So patience was vital. The first computer animated films. So the CGG did manage to make some animations. For example, one of the first experiences with computer animation in major films was in Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan. For a 1982 animation, it looks pretty impressive. Then in 1983, they animated the Death Star hologram in The Return of the Jedi. 1983 was also a big year because John Lasseter joined the team. As an animator, as an actual drawing animator, he had the creative vision to propel CGG. His first projects included The Adventures of Andrea and Wally B, an animated short that was revolutionary at the time. There's a story that when this short premiered, people were on a standing ovation in the first few seconds of the short. They didn't know that it was a whole story animated with characters and stretchy motions, and it looked like a cartoon, like a 3-minute long cartoon. They were just insanely ecstatic of the fact that they were able to render this forest. But even with all this success, there was a big problem. The CGG was trying to resolve its identity. Not even George Lucas understood the entirety of this concept. Well, and now you might wonder, well, why is that important? Well, it turns out that George and his wife, Marcia Lucas, had it. The couple divorced and split everything evenly, which included money, properties, and companies. Now, in the following years, LucasArts went through some tremendous change and transformation, and by 1985, all that remained of the computer department was the CGG. So Catmull, Smith, Blanchard, and DeFrancesco wanted the company to survive. They were sure that in no time they would have the axe as well. The problem was that they had no idea how to run a business. I mean, and their idea made sense. Pixar would attract investors with their computers and finance the animators. The plan was to do this for 5 years to make the movie once the technology finally existed. And again, Pixar relied entirely on the future, but nobody wanted to invest in it. Smith and Catmull went to 35 venture capitalists, and they all said no. The idea was just too abstract. And they had one possible deal with GM, but that fell through due to politics. So Catmull and Smith had no other plans, unless they would call Steve Jobs. So how did Steve Jobs get into Pixar? Months before the deal with GM fell through, Jobs had met with the four to acquire CGG. He cared about the computers, not the animation, but the four had said no. Now, with their tail between their legs, he was their only chance. So Steve Jobs said that he'd finance the company at about half of the GM deal. Lucasfilm was desperate for money, so they took the offer. With a $10 million check, Jobs finalized the deal. He capitalized on the CGG, controlling 70% and the employees 30%. The spin-out covered everything, including the Pixar computer. And so Pixar officially came to life as a company in 1986, as a computer manufacturer and an animation company. It produced shorts like Luke So Jr., an Oscar nominee, and Tintoy, an Oscar winner. Other shorts of this time included Red Stream and Knick-Knack. All of these were massive hits, and in the meantime, they were also implementing some breakthrough technologies to animation, like RenderMan, which would become vital for Hollywood. But that didn't mean that the company had it easy. You see, on one side, the Pixar software was excellent, but on the other side, the Pixar computer really sucked. Plus, it was too expensive. The first Pixar computer sold for $135,000 in 1986. Also, you needed $35,000 worth of software from Sun Systems, and that's not cheap even by today's standards for production. Even Moore's Law couldn't help them. Though the 1986 model was worthless, it was still $35,000 in 1987. So by 1990, it's estimated that Pixar only managed to sell under 300 units. And Steve Jobs was pissed. Smith recalls in an article that Jobs would trash the managers at Pixar, but then he would go and write another check worth a few $1,000,000. From the outside, it made no sense. The company was hemorrhaging money, and they had a product that didn't really work. So why would he write another check? Because Steve Jobs couldn't afford to fail again. So he would write one check after another. Steve Jobs made $100 million from Apple, give or take. In Pixar alone, he had poured $60 million of cold, hard cash. Knowing very well that he was heading for bankruptcy, Jobs took action. In mid-1990, he sold the hardware division for a paltry $2 million. He was sick and tired of this Pixar computer. Still, tensions were high within Pixar. If you don't know, there's a famous whiteboard incident. You see, Steve Jobs loved having control of his whiteboard. No one else could touch it. So in this one meeting, Steve Jobs was berating the Pixar executives for this delay in production, and then Smith pointed out that next, Jobs' other company was also delayed, so that Jobs should better back off from them. And Jobs exploded. In seconds, Smith and Jobs were screaming at each other, and finally Smith went over to the whiteboard and started writing on it in this fit of rage. And then Jobs shouted, "You can't do that," and Smith replied, "I can't write on your whiteboard, that's bullshit." So these were all friendly times. What followed were even more drastic measures. In 1991, he bought the company altogether. Now, all Jobs needed was for the future to arrive. Moore's Law finally comes true. For years, the company aimed to create the movie. And by 1990, it seemed that even in rocky times, they had all the factors. They had John Lasseter, they had good software, and they had ties with Disney. Plus, technology was finally catching up. So after decades, it's time to create a full-length computer-animated film. In 1991, Ed Catmull negotiated and closed the deal with Disney for not one, but for 3 movies. And the deal left Catmull and Smith in awe. They figured that the movie would take like 5 years to make, but still, Disney believed in it enough to pay for 3 films. But then there was the issue of Steve Jobs. Jobs' presence created tension during the negotiations with Disney. You see, John Katzenberg, the head of Disney's film division, already knew Steve Jobs, who had tried to sell him a division of Next Computer. Logically, Catmull and Smith were scared that the two wouldn't get along at all. And for a moment, it seemed that that was going to be the case. So Disney offered a small percentage of the box office earnings plus compensation for the work in the movie. But Jobs wanted more. He wanted a bigger percentage on the box office sales, plus a cut of video earnings and unlimited software rights. And Katzenberg countered. He increased the percentage but didn't yield any rights. And the news was great for Pixar, but tension was still running high. Smith was close to having enough. The insults and the whiteboards and the negotiations, it all had been a bit too much. So he ended up leaving. That's how much he hated working with Steve Jobs. Alvy Ray Smith was willing to part with his dream of decades. He was ready to ditch the movie because he was sick and tired of Steve Jobs. And yes, spoiler alert, that first Pixar movie was Toy Story. And it would be an insane hit, but making it wouldn't be easy. The film that saved Pixar. There's a reason why Toy Story is about toys. At the time, animating skin and human features was just too much of a challenge, and the final result left this plastic-like skin, and you can still see some of that in that movie. But toys were great. So on that front, Pixar had hit it big. When Lasseter showed Disney executives a sample, they fell in love with it. Plus, the voice cast was just impressive. It was the plot that was the problem. You see, Lasseter had written Woody as a mean character to counter Buzz Lightyear's personality, and Disney hated this idea, and the company paused production and went a step above. Disney actually sent John Lasseter to screenwriting classes for months, and that's one of the reasons why Toy Story took 4.5 years to come to fruition. Also, Pixar's fate was riding on this, even Disney's as well. If the first movie didn't pan out, the other 2 most likely wouldn't enter production at all. After months of guidance, Lasseter turned Woody into the character that we all know and love. Then Disney even announced a launch date, Thanksgiving 1995. When the screenings came along, critics loved the film, and so did Steve Jobs. Well, He, of course, loved the financial potential of it, but just months after the showings, he took over as president of Pixar. Now, at this point, Steve Jobs was sure that Toy Story would be a hit. In the first weekend alone, Toy Story earned $39 million. The film would rack up $200 million throughout the theatrical release. And Toy Story had been the movie, and it had cost everyone involved more than they could have ever predicted. But the story, of course, doesn't end there. It gets much more interesting. Just 1 week after Toy Story, on November 29th, 1995, Pixar had an IPO. The narrative persists. Pixar had one feature film. That was the only selling point. But the promise was that movies would get better, which still sounded crazy. Still, Jobs went through with the IPO, and it was a huge hit. It was the biggest IPO of the year. Pixar then produced A Bug's Life in 1998, and Toy Story 2 in 1999, and then Monsters, Inc. in 2001. So the three were enormous critical and financial hits. So it's a fairy tale ending, right? Well, no, because one side of the story is about animated films, and the other one is about money. The relationship with Disney, who was the distributor, had reached this boiling point. So by 2004, Jobs had hinted that in 2006, he would stop working with Disney altogether. So the news shocked the world since Pixar had proved its worth and Disney could reap huge benefits from this. But Steve Jobs and Disney CEO Michael Eisner were tough negotiators, as we've seen. Plus, they didn't really like each other. But after pressure from the board, Eisner resigned, and Bob Iger came in.
Oh, sorry, Michael.
And as soon as he took the role of Disney CEO, he wanted to acquire Pixar. By then, the movies had garnered more than $2 billion in revenue, and the potential was there for a lot more. But he knew that Steve Jobs had a reputation, so he called him with the offer to buy Pixar altogether. He expected a rant, and instead he got a, hey, well, that's not such a crazy idea. But when the two met, things were different. First of all, Jobs pulled out the whiteboards. He listed the pros and cons, and we have to give it to Jobs. Some of these were valid. Jobs believed that Pixar's culture was too valuable. Disney could kill it and destroy the essence that made Pixar great. So if he was to sell Pixar, Jobs needed a guarantee that the Pixar vision would survive. And what he did was leverage this to become a majority shareholder. And that's the story a lot of people know. So when Pixar announced the sale, the world said that Steve Jobs had revolutionized animation. And yes, he did to a degree, but he wasn't alone. For a decade before he arrived, visionaries were looking for this movie. So we can't say that Steve Jobs changed the company entirely. But what we can say is that most likely, Pixar changed Steve Jobs. As for the rest, I'm sure they were watching the news back then at the moment when we started this video. It's June 2006. Disney announced that it would buy Pixar for $7.4 billion. With this purchase, Disney hopes to revamp the animation division. Pixar will continue to create groundbreaking films. And as for Steve Jobs, he gets the last laugh, just like he did with Apple. He's not only worth billions, but he's also a majority owner of Disney. You have to give it to him.